Hello, my name is Emerson
And my name is Adam Wong.
and today we have a treat for you guys. So Adam and I are piano players, mainly classical piano, and for the past 2 or so months we've been researching different classical pianists. Who have we been researching, Adam?
We've been researching Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, and Debussy.
Yeah, and with these different classical pianists, all from different eras in writing music, we researched how they wrote music, what methods they used when writing a piece. We researched their style and technique their technique in writing pieces too. And with all of that information we gathered, we used different styles and different ways of writing music to write our own piece of music on piano.
Yeah.
And you guys get to see that at the end of the video.
All right, let's get into it. All right, so the first classical musician that we'll start with is Bach.
Bach was self-taught in music composition like a lot of the other musical composers because of his natural ability from birth to discern what a lot of good music is, I guess, at the time.
His study method followed the customs of his day back then, which was being able to copy workbooks of music of French, German, and Italian composers of his time and earlier. So he would copy these musics by ear, and he was just naturally able to do that.
The interesting thing about Bach was that he often made a lot of different arrangements from other composers at the time, which differentiated himself from a lot of the other composers at the time, which everyone knows Bach for all the music that he made, but also at that time he was also well known for making great arrangements of other music that other composers made.
Bach, so the piano wasn't actually invented back then. He often played the organ and the harpsichord, which was the piano of the time in the 1600s.
He's also one of the most productive composers that the world's ever had. He's composed over 1,000 different pieces.
Bach was a master of counterpoint. Counterpoint is basically where there's two musical lines or voices harmonizing with each other while staying independent in their own rhythm and contour.
We'll demonstrate counterpoint right here.
Yep.
Hey Adam, can you explain counterpoint a little more?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to be playing Prelude in D major by none other than Bach, and just listen to the right hand for a moment. So you should hear right now in the right hand two lines that are very, very different from each other just in one hand. So do you hear like the going down from, while also hearing the, while you're also hearing the top line.
Wow, so it's two different melodies in one hand.
Yeah, and then Bach, of course, was a master of this, so he combined the left hand with this as well, and you get.
So you're saying that counterpoint is the combination of multiple different melodies?
That's exactly correct.
Nice. So when we were writing this piece, we wanted to use some element of Bach in it, and what we used was his ability to create counterpoint and music. And so what we did when writing this piece was create a melody in the left hand that stands out, and also create a melody in the right hand that stands out. So the melodies are really simple. The right hand melody is just, which is just 3 notes ascending. And then the left hand melody is also really simple, just 2 notes back and forth. But we also filled it up with different notes. So you'll hear the two melodies hopefully lined out.
All right, thanks, Emerson.
You're welcome.
All right, let's get back to the video.
So make sure to listen to that part in the piece when you get to hear it all at the end. I think we should move on to a different composer now.
Yeah, so the next composer in the timeline of classical music is Mozart.
Yeah, so Mozart wrote music in the classical period of music, which is different than Bach, who wrote music in the Baroque period.
So Mozart often modulated his music, which is play in a different key, and use contrapuntal forms, basically counterpoint, and fuse them together to make cleaner classical forms.
Yeah, so Mozart not only was a pianist like Bach, he played many different instruments. He could play violin really well, could play organ, many different instruments, and that was helpful to him while he was writing all of his music.
And very like Bach, he was super skilled at sight reading and improvisation, and he composed over 600 works. And at that time, he was definitely the undisputed master of music.
So Bach studied with many different composers. He even studied with Bach, but also studied with Handel. And this in itself influenced a lot of his different works. So even though he was in the classical period of music, since he got much teaching from many different composers in the Baroque style, he also played with a heavy Baroque style, even though he helped transition into the classical style of piano.
Yeah, so when he composes music, his goal was to be succinct and clear and well balanced, while at the same time, he wanted to develop ideas to a point of emotionally satisfying fullness.
Let's demonstrate that.
Yeah, sure, let's get into it. All right, so this is Fantasia in D minor, written by none other than Mozart. And basically he used a bunch of like chords to make a really rich sound, unlike Bach, who would compose and make different like notes, but all separated. So you can definitely hear this in this little piece of music.
Wow, that was really full sounding.
And it definitely showed some emotion.
Nice. Okay, thank you, Adam, for that demonstration of how Mozart played with a lot of rich and full sound. Do we have any other research about Mozart?
Yeah, so Mozart, if you guys didn't know, he didn't live very long. He only lived up to 35. So even though he was young, he was a classical boy genius. And he would like to often think of his whole work before putting down on paper, which was proven by his manuscripts.
Yeah, at the same time, Mozart had a lot of troubles in his life. He struggled financially for much of his life, and lots of his family died as he was growing up. So oftentimes that contributed a lot to his pieces of music, often reflecting somber tones. Again, like we just heard when Adam played.
So when writing music, Mozart often worked for hours at a time. It was common that Mozart would write all his music in his head because of his perfect pitch, but actually that was not true. So often he would need a piano by his side when composing in order to specifically decide which notes he should use where.
Yeah, so when writing our piece, we could not write this piece in our heads, unfortunately.
Nope.
So like Mozart, we often just stayed next to the piano, editing our music a lot in order to get the final piece, which is also similar to what Mozart did. Mozart edited his music a ton. He never was fully satisfied with his pieces of work until he knew he had spent hours upon hours on them, making them as perfect as possible. He also used an abbreviated style of notation or writing notes when he was writing his music. So when he was writing it on a piece of paper, it was easier for him to go back and edit it. Should we move on to our next composer?
Yes.
So now we'll move on to our next composer, which is Beethoven.
Yeah, so Beethoven was actually in the middle between classical period and the Romantic era. So the classical period consisted of rigorous observance of form, like Bach, and the relative free form of the Romantic period, which we will be going about next, which is Chopin.
So Beethoven, like Mozart, often modulated his key in all of his pieces, which means he started in an original key, and then eventually over time he switched to play in a different key of music, which definitely keeps his music into a nice flow and keeps it moving and interesting.
Beethoven had the innovation of the ability to rapidly establish a solidity in contracting different keys and adding unexpected notes. So basically this would add to the harmony of the harmonic realm and creating a sense of a vast musical space that which the music would move freely.
Beethoven also, interestingly enough, when writing his music, he made many different sketches to symbolize his music, which we thought was interesting. He also, when writing, typically wrote in he made many different short drafts of his music, which we did take to custom when we were writing our own piece of music. We looked at it in many different short spurts, different ideas, and then, like Beethoven, at the end we combined them all together after making our own edits on each short draft.
So Beethoven had a little dark part of himself, and that was the fact that he was deaf, and he was struggling throughout this time.
Yeah, so Beethoven struggled a lot in his life, like Mozart, with many different issues. Many people that knew him didn't even seem to like him that much, as they thought he was quick to temper a lot of times because of his deafness. And this is often reflected in his music, like Mozart, a darker side to his music.
And Beethoven, he wasn't actually accepted during his time because they thought he was being too dramatic. The sounds of his compositions just didn't appeal to the public during his time, and then this only became realized later that it was actually pretty nice, and that's when the Romantic era started.
Yeah, so the main difference between the Romantic era of music and the classical era, which of course Mozart was in, was the Romantic period. Composers definitely did a lot more of what they wanted to in their pieces, and they kind of decided not to officially play by the rules of music, and they sped the piece up, or they slowed it down, or changed keys more often, and often played in harsher tones.
Yeah, so Beethoven was still considered in the classical period, and emotion in music just started becoming more important. Like in Mozart, emotion was important. But it wasn't stretched to Beethoven's level. So Beethoven would stretch the old forms to their limits, and he was more flexible and dramatic in his songs.
Beethoven also composed many different sonatas, which the key identifying factor of a sonata is that it has many different movements to it. We'll now demonstrate a first movement of one of his sonatas.
Yeah, and these were usually fast.
So Adam, what piece are you going to be playing?
I'll be playing Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique, Opus 13, Movement 1.
So what normally classifies a first movement in a sonata?
So Beethoven's sonata is the first movement is usually the fast one, or the allegro. And I'll be skipping the intro to get right into it.
Nice. That was awesome.
Thanks.
Nice job, Adam. That was great for learning about first movement in sonatas.
Thank you.
Well, what else did we learn about Beethoven?
So Beethoven had perfect pitch, and when he lost his hearing, he had imagined all the sounds in his head because he had perfect pitch, but he couldn't actually hear it.
Yeah, and even though he did use his perfect pitch a ton when writing his music, he did try to use some different methods in order to hear what he was playing on the piano better. For example, oftentimes he put his head next to on the piano in order to try to hear the sounds coming from it. And also he cut the legs off of his piano or off one of his pianos so it could be on the floor so that the floor would project the sound up more.
Yeah, I can't even fathom how hard it must have been to compose music while being deaf. He would sometimes have to put a pencil in his mouth and have the tip of the pencil on the piano soundboard and feel the vibrations coming up the pencil and use that to compose music.
We also learned that Beethoven started to lose his hearing over time. So first he lost his higher register of hearing. So during that period of time, he wrote a lot of his music in the lower register. But once he went almost completely deaf, then he opened his music back up again.
Yeah, and I wonder if my pathetique is involved in that little period where he composed in the lower register, because everything seems to be in the lower register in that song.
All right, let's move on to our next composer.
All right, so our next composer that we'll be going over is Chopin.
Yeah, so Chopin, being a little bit later than Beethoven, was fully part of the Romantic era, and he was also Polish. So both of those contributed greatly to his music, as he pulled lots of styles and techniques from the Romantic era, and he also had a very traditional. He brought in lots of traditional Polish, I guess, music techniques when writing his pieces.
Yeah, so Chopin wrote often only with improvisation, such as the famous song Fantasy Impromptu.
Yeah, Chopin also, as well, in his music, had lots of emotional ambiguity. So oftentimes he had a lot of emotion in his pieces, but that emotion was not clearly labeled as this is a happy song or a sad song. It was often left up for the audience's interpretation.
Yeah, I really like how he would leave the feeling up to the audience or to the performer to decide, which is really important when it comes to playing Chopin.
Yeah, Chopin as well had used many different simple melodies within his pieces. So even though he would build lots around the melodies, he made sure the melodies stand out more than anything. And we can show you how we use that in our very own piece. Let's go.
Hey Emerson, what's a simple melody in our own piece?
Yeah, so the simple melody we used in our piece, just playing the right hand, is this. But like Chopin, we obviously built around that melody and brought it back several times throughout the piece, eventually building up to...
Wow, Emerson, that sounded great.
Thank you, Adam.
All right, and let's get back to the video. Nice job, Emerson. What else did we learn from Chopin?
Yeah, so Chopin also used, oftentimes when he did have his main melody, he went up into the higher register of the piano to clearly label or outline the melody. He often used the higher notes on the piano to create a female voice in his music.
Yeah, and then as shown in our own piece, Chopin focused on patterns, and he would harmonize progressions with articulation or rhythm to further expand the music.
Yeah, as well when Chopin was building up to climax in his piece. He oftentimes had his right hand going up the piano and his left hand going down to create a really full and rich sound that would, I guess, get the audience ready for what was about to come.
All right, Emerson, show us how Chopin reached the pinnacle of his piece.
Yeah, and this is a section in Ballade 1 in G minor.
Wow, Emerson, that was magnificent.
Thanks, Adam.
You could definitely hear how powerful with the upper tones and the lower tones that was. All right.
Truly Chopin. All right, let's move on to our next composer.
All right, so the next composer that we'll be going over is Debussy.
So Debussy was a little bit different than these other composers such as Bach or Mozart, because when he was writing harmonies, he didn't use traditional harmony theory. Instead, he used many dissonant chords and non-harmonic tones, which are basically chords that are used to kind of clash with the rest of the piece. So many different clashing notes stacked on top of each other in order to make the nicer sounding parts sound better. He also used a form of counterpoint like the other composers, but instead of traditional counterpoint, he used polyrhythms within his counterpoint, which polyrhythms are two different melodies stacked on top of each other, but they have different rhythms totally.
Debussy also used these tones to manipulate the key of the piece and create ambiguity when the listener is trying to find a tonic or root note in the piece.
Debussy's music also was very fluid and transitioned between different sections of the piece really fluidly, unlike Chopin and other composers. We'll show you that right here.
Emerson, what are you demonstrating for us?
So I'm going to be playing Arabesque No. 1 by Debussy, and this is demonstrating how he fluidly transitions between different parts. So there he had many different sections of the piece, but never stopping between these sections. He just rolled straight through them all.
Thanks, Emerson. Thanks, Emerson. I love that song.
Thank you.
Debussy also used many clusters of notes, basically chords, and along with that, he used non-harmonic tones, and we'll be showing you that right now.
All right, Adam, what are you demonstrating?
So I'll be playing Pour le Piano by Debussy, and you'll get to hear the clusters of notes with the non-harmonic tones, basically making augmented chords.
Nice job demonstrating how Debussy used clashing tones, Adam.
Thanks.
We've used both of Debussy's fluid motions in his pieces and his clashing tones to create our piece of art, the piece of our own. And now it's the moment you've all been waiting for. This is the end of our podcast. We will now play you our piece.
Let's get into it.